All right, so grab your Bibles, turn to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13. If you want to use the Bibles there in the pews, you can find Romans 13 on page 845. 845. How many of you are a little nervous this morning? I know my wife is. They say there are two things you should never talk about in public or with family or among friends, and that is what? Politics and religion. Well, you know that when you come to church every Sunday, you're going to get one, right? You're going to get religion. Well, today and over the next few weeks, we're going to give you a double whammy. We're going to talk about politics as well. Our new message series is called Let's Talk. Let's Talk. And over the course of the next few weeks, we're going to talk about what religion and politics have to do with each other. We're going to talk about church politics, and then we're going to wrap this up at the end, just before the election, with what our role is, what we should be doing as a church when it comes to government, politics, and all that good stuff. So, still feeling nervous? I know my wife is. She's like, I can't believe you're doing this, but this is going to be all right. I thought this might be a timely message series because we're coming up upon one of the most controversial elections I know I've ever seen, and it's getting more and more heated by the day. It's almost like a soap opera. I can't wait to turn on the news when I get home because I want to see what's going on. But I want to be clear here and make sure you hear me on this. We are not going to endorse any particular candidate. I am not going to tell you for whom I am voting. Our elders are going to keep their mouths shut too. We're not going to encourage you to go down any particular party line. We're not going to say Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, whatever. So we just want to see what the Bible, what God says about politics and the government. That's it. So let's jump into this. I'm going to tell you a story. There's a story about a government surveyor who showed up at a man's farm to do some work for the county and for the state by which he was employed. So the government surveyor knocked on the farmhouse door and asked the farmer for permission to go out into one of his fields to do some work, to take some readings. Well, the farmer, of course, had no hospitality for any government workers of any kind. No hospitality. And so he thought, maybe the government's here to take some of my land for a public project, you know what I mean? And so he refused to give the man permission to work in any of his fields. No way I'm going to let you do that. Well, of course, the government surveyor then produced some official documents from his employers, the government, that authorized him to do the survey. And he told the farmer, I have the authority to enter any field that I want to in this county to do my work. Well, faced with the authority of the county and of the state and, of course, the federal government, the farmer reluctantly opened the gate to allow the surveyor to enter one of his fields. Well, the farmer then went to the other side of the field where he opened another gate through which one of his fiercest bulls came charging through. And of course, seeing the bull, the government surveyor dropped all his machinery, all his equipment. He began to run for his life, and the farmer shouted after him, "Show him that paper. Show him your authority." We love that, huh? But I want us to think about it for a moment. I want you to consider for a moment what's your attitude toward government? What is our attitude toward government? It's much like the farmer, isn't it? We're a lot like the farmer where I'm the good guy and he's the bad guy. Government's the bad guys. And we do everything we can to resist the government's control and claim on us. You think about it from driving the speed limit to paying our taxes. We love to push the boundaries a little bit, don't we? And we do everything we can to keep the government out of our lives, out of our homes, out of our personal issues, because they're the enemy and we're the good guys. But what does God have to say about government? What's the church's role? What should we do? What shouldn't we do? And I want to tell you, this might be a tough pill to swallow this morning for some of you if you've never heard this verse from Romans chapter 13. But the first 8 words of Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 13, they say this, and it's written at the top of your message notes: everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. Everyone must submit. Here's that word submit. Where have you heard that one before? Guys, come on, men in the room. You want to say it, right? Huh? Come on, let's say it together. Wives, submit to your husbands. Oh, okay, that's like the only time you can ever say it. Don't say it at home, right? We've heard this word submit, haven't we? So it's used like 38 times in the New Testament. Wives, submit to your husbands. We like that one. We're also told to submit ourselves to God. James 4:7. It also says workers are to submit to themselves to their employers, 1 Peter 2:18. Young people are to submit to older people, 1 Peter 5:5. We're told as church members that we are to submit to our leaders' authority, Hebrews 13:7. And then Paul instructs us to even submit to each other. As the church, we are to submit to each other out of reverence for Christ in Ephesians 5:21. Now, at least three times in the New Testament, we find that we are to submit to our government. And that might be a tough pill. We find it here once in this verse, Romans 13:1. Later on in the same chapter, we'll read that one. And then over in 1 Peter 2:13, look what Peter writes there. He says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority or to governors," and he goes on from there. So what does this word submit actually mean? What am I doing if I'm going to submit to the government? And I love how the NIV translates the Greek word in Romans 13:1 because it's perfect. It says that we must submit. The Greek word is imperative. We must submit to our governing authorities. We have no option. It is a requirement. It is a commandment, essentially. We must abide by the rules of the land, must submit. So what does it mean? The word submit, writes this in your message notes, means to place under. To place under. We are to place ourselves under the authority of local, state, and federal laws and obey the rules which they have established. It's not easy, is it? I would venture to say, and I've kind of asked this question already, many of us are scared to see what's going to happen when either Trump or Clinton takes the White House in 2017. We are scared, no doubt. Some of you are thinking, are they going to take my guns away? Are my taxes going to go up? Will we end up in a nuclear war? Will the economy collapse? Is the government going to take care of me? Will we really be stronger together? Can we really make America great again? I don't know. I'm scared, man. I don't know what's going to happen. Now, I don't want to belittle your thoughts here on who might be the next president of the United States. But I want you to think about the context under which Paul is writing to the Romans in Romans 13:1. Think about what they're going through. These 8 words that Paul wrote to the Roman church probably shocked them. They probably read these words and said, holy cow. Here, they're living under one of the most wicked and cruel empires ever to govern the Mediterranean world. Their emperor is Nero. Remember Nero? We've talked about him here at church. We know Nero. Nero was pretty wicked. He had a vendetta against Christianity. He made it a law. If you see a Christian, you kill him. If you know who Christians are, you get rid of them. In fact, he used Christians and burned them as torches for his midnight garden parties. That's how bad Nero was. He would send them into the arena in the Colosseums where Christians would be mauled by lions by the hundreds and thousands. Nero is a pretty bad man, and I don't want to belittle what our thoughts are about who's going to be the next president of the United States, but the Roman people have it pretty bad. And Paul tells them, you must submit to the governing authorities. Why? Why? Why would they just go along with the laws of the land? Why would they place themselves under, submit? Why would they place themselves under the authority, the same authority that has been killing Christians and just killing them just because they follow Jesus. Why would they do that? And why would we submit to government that, to put as simply as I can, maybe we don't trust anymore? Why should we? Why should we submit to government? Well, fortunately, Paul offers some explanation, and he gives us some answers. We're going to look at verse 1 again. It'll be on the screen this time. Here's what he says to the Romans. He says, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. Then he says, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. So here's the first one. Write this in your notes. We submit to governing authorities because God has ordained them. God has put them in place. He has established governing authorities. Now, throughout history, you can see how God has done this. He started with Adam and Eve. He gave them law and order. You must work the Garden of Eden and multiply on the earth and rule over it, rule over everything, animals, fish, sea, everything. Later on, God used Noah to save him and his family during the flood so that people on earth could still survive. And he gave Noah and his family new rules. Here's how you are to live. God called Abram at the time, to be the father of many nations. God raised up Moses to lead a nation out of Egypt. And he established the Ten Commandments, the law, through Moses and how the people were to live. God used judges later on in Israel to lead people back to God. And then later on, he anoints kings over Israel and told them how to rule. And throughout all of history, no nation has existed without God's establishing some type of government, law and order. This is God's doing throughout all of history with every nation that has ever existed. We can see that. But I want to ask this question. Have we, because God has instituted all these nations, including the United States of America, God has established our rulers, our authorities, our nation, our law and order, have we forgotten our God? Have we forgotten? Now, that's a loaded question, but I want to tell you it's not a new problem. We go back to President Abraham Lincoln in March 30th, 1863, when he assumed leadership of a nation on the brink of civil war. Look what he says. President Abraham Lincoln says, we have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. And he lists a bunch of stuff there. And then he says, but we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended power, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness. That's President Abraham Lincoln, some 153 years ago, a nation who had forgotten God. Do you think we've forgotten God today? Absolutely. But you know what's cool? We haven't. I don't think our church family has forgotten God, and that's important. That's important. I want to go on. We'll kind of come back to this because later on I'll address what happens to a nation that gets unruly and forgets God. We'll get to that in a second. I want to read on and give you a couple more reasons why we should submit ourselves to the government. Now, verse 2 and following, Paul continues. He says, consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then go the speed limit. Oh, wait, it doesn't say that, but that's important. You think about it. When you're driving past the speed limit, you're going faster than you should. What are you doing? Checking the mirrors. Where are the cops? Are people flashing their lights at me because I don't want to get a ticket? Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. All right, for he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary, here's that word submit, to submit them to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. Now, we find two reasons here why we should submit to our governing authorities, and here's the first one. They restrain evil. They restrain evil. And we understand that one, I think. You know, we expect criminals to be held accountable for their wrongdoing. Correct? You know, I mean, murderers, rapists, drug dealers, thieves, they ought to be brought to justice. We expect that to happen. Our government provides the authority to handle such cases. If you get caught running a red light or speeding down the expressway, you expect that you're going to get a ticket. That's what government does. If you're doing something wrong, you're going to pay the penalty, especially if you get caught. Now, God has established our government to keep our people safe. That's the whole thing. We submit to God, and therefore we submit to our governing authorities, which God has established. All right? But what happens when the government forgets God? Here's where we're going to get into it for a second. All right? So government is supposed to restrain evil. What happens when the government is evil itself? Ever think about that? Well, let's take a walk through history again. Here we go. When God wanted to take his people out of oppression and slavery in Egypt, remember that? What did he do? He sent 10 plagues to soften Pharaoh's hard heart and eventually allowed Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. When Israel rebelled against God when they were in the promised land, what did God do? Well, he sent the Assyrians and the Babylonians to take control and captive Israel. And so Israel would learn. They had started worshiping idols and false gods and images. And God said, I'm not going to have any of that. So he rose up a nation to take care of it. When Israel then repented of their ways when they were in Babylon and Assyria, what happened? Well, God then raised up a man named Cyrus, the king of the Medes and Persians, to set his people free and bring them back into the promised land. You see what's happening? God didn't stop there. Was it just chance that at the time God's Son was to enter the world, that Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken over the whole Roman Empire? Not coincidence. That makes sense. God put him in place along with Quirinius, who was the governor of Syria at the time. And things happened. Was it just chance that the good news about Jesus' victory over sin and death, his death on the cross and resurrection from the grave, was it just coincidence that this happened at a time when the world had the best roads in history? They had an efficient postal service. They had safe travels. They had law and order. It's not coincidence. God established these governments for a reason. And again, those circumstances came about through the plan of the one who establishes authority. So what about wicked governments? What about the communists who tried to snuff out the gospel? Is God responsible for that? What about Adolf Hitler? What about Saddam Hussein? What about Osama bin Laden? What about the leader of ISIS right now? Did God establish their authority and their position? Everybody go like this. God establishes the authority, but here's the deal. They're the ones responsible for their actions. They're the ones who have to answer for the decisions they make. In their sinful human nature, they have abused the authority that God has given them. Does that make sense? Yeah. God has placed them in a position of authority, but they abuse what God has done. They abuse the authority in the position that God has placed them in. What about those immoral and corrupt and crooked politicians in our own government? Is God responsible for their power? He put them there. We put them there, right? But God put them there for a reason, to rule our people and to make laws and to keep us safe. But what happens? Who's responsible for their actions? Not God. They are. They're responsible for their actions. So whether a government is good or bad, whether our candidate is elected or not, whether we agree with the government or not, we are to submit to the governing authorities because they have been established by God. Does that make sense? It's hard to get your head wrapped around it. But man, when you look at it as a battle, spiritual battle between good and evil, that's what's happening. That's what's happening. Think about this. It was Jesus who was on trial before Pontius Pilate. Do you remember this? Pontius Pilate had a false understanding of his own authority. In John chapter 19, we read this. Pilate said, "Don't you realize, Jesus, that I have the power either to set you free or crucify you?" Pilate thinks he has the power. Then Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." Wow. You can't tell me God didn't put Adolf Hitler in charge. He put Pilate in charge, and look what happened. He sent his own son to death on a cross. God has the authority and power over our governing authorities, and he puts them in power for a purpose. And I'll tell you what, you said it, we have forgotten God. As a country, we have forgotten God. And I am scared to death, more scared to see what might happen because we have forgotten our God than who's going to be the next president of the United States. Our country must come back to God, plain and simple. Here's the next one. Not only do they restrain evil, but they also reward good. They reward good. I'll give you a moment to think about that one. How do they reward us for our good? Anybody ever receive a reward or an award for obeying the law? Yeah, I didn't think so. I've not stood on a podium because I've been driving the speed limit all my life, right? It doesn't happen that way. So how does the government reward good? Well, I like to call this blessings from God through government. Think about what the government does do for us. They give us highways, libraries, schools, police departments, fire departments, justice systems. They even allow us to worship in our own way. They ensure free trade and fair business practices. They maintain our armed forces to protect our borders and to protect its people. And we may not like everything the government does in these issues, but the fact remains that God uses these authorities. He has established them in order to bless us. And if you pay your taxes and you follow the law, then you can enjoy these benefits. They reward good. If you stay out of jail, if you pay your taxes, you can go down to the library and read all the books you want. You can go to school. You can have the fire department show up at your house if it starts burning down, right? They do provide good. They reward good. Paul writes this in Ephesians 1:22. He says, "And God placed all things under his feet." Whose feet? Jesus' feet. God placed everything under Jesus' feet and appointed him to be head over everything for the church. Did you catch that? To be head over everything for the church. In other words, Jesus is king of all the kings of the earth. Jesus is Lord over all the lords who have authority over people. Jesus is the president of the United States, and he uses the government of the world for the good of his church, for his church. You see, we're going to win one day. Amen? We're going to win one day, and Jesus is going to stand there and say, "Welcome in. You are victorious. You withstood everything because of me." This leads us into the last two verses on government from Romans 13. Paul says this. You're ready to swallow. "This is also why you pay taxes." Oh, man. "This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, pay taxes." Right? If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect, and if honor, then honor. Maybe you've heard about a letter that was sent to the IRS one time. The letter said this: "I did not pay the taxes I should have this past year, and I've been unable to sleep. Enclosed is $150. If I still have trouble sleeping, then I'll send the rest." Yeah, that's our view on taxes, right? Pay as least as you can, We have an obligation from God to submit to our governing authorities. And this means, write this in your notes, I will meet my obligations to them. I will meet my obligations to the ruling and governing authorities. This includes paying our taxes. We can't be like the farmer who sent the bull after the government surveyor. We can't. Our attitude toward governing authorities must please God. And with a Christ-like attitude, we will meet our obligations to the governing authorities. This means that I'll obey the law and that I'll pay my taxes. What each of us owes the government, of course, it's going to vary from person to person. Some of us will owe very little. Some of us will owe a lot. And the fact is, we owe it to them, right? Whatever that tax is. And I don't want to debate over whether or not the taxes are too high or unfair. We have the right to vote to change the tax system, don't we? I mean, we've done it. But here's the thing. We're not to cook the books. We're not to fudge the numbers. We're not to stretch the law. We're to just pay our taxes. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Jesus said that, right? But here's the thing. On top of paying taxes, as much as we might strain to do that, we must respect our authorities. We must respect them. Maybe you're like I am. I love to hear a good joke about the president. I love to hear good jokes and josh around about, failing government, and just kind of jab them a little bit. But here's the thing, and I'm calling myself on the carpet here. I'm calling me on the carpet here. We are to respect them. We're called to respect them, as we would respect the one from whom they've received their authority. If you respect God, then you respect authority. And that's tough. So, I don't know, maybe this week you're out and about, you run around town, you see a policeman. Why don't you thank him for the job he does or she does to protect you in this city? See a firefighter this week. Shake his hand. Shake her hand. Thank them for serving you, keeping our city safe. We have representatives in our own city. And I'll tell you what, it goes a long way when you write a note thanking them for the job they're doing. Trust me, I've written to my council person a couple times. It goes a long way. Because all they hear is complaining. But we're the church. And we're to submit to them and respect them and encourage them. So what if you did something like that this week? It'd be great. We can sympathize with the farmer who used a bull to chase off a government surveyor. We know the government can seem unfair and oppressive at times. But these verses from Romans chapter 13, they remind us to think about our government in line with God's will. And I don't have time to talk about this, but if authorities tell you to do something that's against God's will, against God's law, you don't have to do it. I don't have time to talk about that today. But outside of that, think about our government in line with God's will. He lets us see that God has ordained them, that they restrain evil, they reward good, and He reminds us to meet our obligations by paying our taxes and honoring those who work for us. So let us submit. Let's place ourselves under their authority, that it may go well with us and before our God.